Thank you, Alain, for your invitation and your introduction. Thank you, everybody, for your presence here this morning. As Alain said, I changed the title of this lecture, which is now Die Aufklärung. I wanted to maintain the German expression because Aufklärung is something very specific in German, and it is also the title of a book by Adorno and Horkheimer, which is The Dialectic of Aufklärung, der Aufklärung. You can follow this conference on Twitter by using our platform, Polemic Tweet, which is developed by the team of the Institute for Research and Innovation. And I precise this because this platform is an occurrence of what I call and we call in the Institute for Research and Innovation of the Pompidou Center, technologies for trans-individuation. After this lecture, Yuki and Harry Halpin will develop this topic in panels in the morning. The public access to the web is 20 years old. Through it, digital society has developed throughout the entire world. But has this society become münlich? I say that in German. That is, in English, mature, or in French, majeur. That is, in the sense that Immanuel Kant used this term to define the age of enlightenment as an exit from minority, from what he called Unmünlichkeit. Certainly not. Contemporary society seems, on the contrary, to have become profoundly regressive. Mental disorders, as well as environmental, economic, political, and military problems constantly proliferate and increase, while the spread of traceability seems to be used primarily to increase the heteronomy of individuals through behavior profiling rather than their autonomy. If digitalization clearly holds promise in many ways, and I am convinced of this, socializing digitalization is in a reasoned and resolute way is the first condition for the world to escape from the impasse in which the obsolete consumerist model finds itself. Then, this socialization requires the creation and negotiation of a new legal framework, which itself presupposes the formation of new enlightenments. I'm thus delighted that Neelie Kroes has called for a new enlightenment philosophy for the digital age, just as Tim Berners-Lee and Harry Halpin have argued, in dialogue with the position of Windsurf, who developed the TCP/IP protocol, that internet access must become a universal right. But here, what exactly does access mean? Or again, what type of access should we claim will bring light or enlightenment rather than darkness or shadow? Under what conditions will such access be beneficial for individuals and the societies in which they live. Responding to these questions and in the first place posing them correctly, such is the challenge we face today. And to try to take the measure of these questions, it is necessary to see how, for example, in his book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr outlines the context that constitutes the stakes of this global summit on the web that is meeting here this year. The spread of the digitalization since 1992 has resulted in a true chain reaction that has transformed social life at its most public level, as well as psychical life at its most intimate level. The Shallows exposes the immense distress that has accompanied this meteoric rise, which is seen more and more as a tsunami, greatly disrupting the mental capacities of Nicholas Carr himself, according to his own account, and which may well sweep away all the inherited structures of civilization on every continent, which may in turn produce immense disillusionment and even a terrible disaffection. Faced with the fact that the negativity of this new situation is continuing to take hold, we must affirm the necessity and the positivity of a new state of law. To do so, we must turn to the question of the relationship between technology and law. What we refer to as the law is, in fact, grounded in writing. Now, digital technology constitutes the last stage of writing. And just as writing was in the age of Socrates, so too today the digital is for us a pharmacon. It can lead either to the destruction of the mind or to its rebirth. I would like here to develop the following points. First, the constitution of a new state of law, a new rule of law, founded on digital writing, in fact presupposes a new age of enlightenment. Second, these new enlightenments must, however, critique the limits of the philosophy of the Aufklärung itself, notably in relation to the question raised by the philosophical engineering developed at the W3C at the instigation of Tim Berners-Lee. And third, the new philosophy which must arise from the worldwide experience of the web and more generally of the digital across all cultures, an experience that is, in this sense, universal. This new philosophy, these new enlightenments cannot merely be that of digital lights. It must be a philosophy of shadows, and maybe of shallows, to speak with Nicholas Carr, of the shadows which inevitably accompany all light. We can no longer ignore the irreducibly pharmacological character of writing, that is, its ambivalent character, whether writing be alphabetical or digital, etched in stone or inscribed on paper or in silicon or on screens of digital light. Writing, and more precisely printed writing, is a condition of enlightenment, and it is for this reason that Kant says that it is addressed to the public, I quote Kant, public who reads, unquote. But there is never light without shadow. And it is for this reason that in 1944, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer were able to perceive in the rationalization of the world. They used the word rationalization in the sense of Max Weber, the opposite of reason and of the Aufklärung. This irreducible ambivalence, which applies to technology in general, and which the 21st century, like Nicholas Carr, discovers almost every day through 1,000 experiences of the limits and ambiguities of technological progress. This irreducible ambivalence is what neither modern philosophy nor ancient philosophy were able to think. And this is what, faced with the new challenges of the digital world, it is today imperative to us to understand. It is with this that we must learn to think and to live differently. Unlike Tim Berners-Lee and Harry Halpin, Windsurf argues that internet access cannot be subjected to law because digital technology is an artifact which can change and which never stops changing. But was not writing, which in Greece was at the origin of law as well as of geometrical thinking, that is, of rationality, itself equally artifactual. It seems that writing has become stabilized and universalized as alphabetical writing, and it seems as though, as such, through this writing and through its apparent stability, it is universal structures of language and beyond language, the universal structures of thought, which were discovered. This is how it may seem, but things are perhaps not quite so clear. And here lies the true stakes of a debate with that philosophy which we have inherited in the epoch of generalized digitalization. What has been the role of writing and beyond that of techniques in the constitution of thought, and especially of that thought which has universalized through the Enlightenment and through its emancipatory discourse? With the development of the web, such a debate has become unavoidable. And it is a debate that I argue must be held in the framework of digital studies. And within that framework, this is a fundamental question. If Tim Berners-Lee and Harry Halpin can raise the question of a universal right to internet access, a question that a philosophy underlying the conception of the web must incarnate, and of which W3C would be the bearer. This is precisely because the web is a function of a digital technical system which could be otherwise, and which could even disappear. And if they argue that it is a right, it is because this philosophy and this stability must support the need to ensure not only a certain conception of the internet, of its functions and its goals, but the sense of mental, intellectual, spiritual, social, and let's say noetic progress, noetic in the sense of Aristotle, that digitalization in general must constitute. In order to explore these formidable questions, we must take the measure of the following 2 points. First, the digital technical system constitutes a global and contributory publication and editorialization system that radically transforms the public thing, given that the res publica, the republic, presupposes a form of publicness, of publicity, what the Aufklärung called an Öffentlichkeit, sustained by processes of publication. Second, this publication system is inscribed in the history of a process of grammatization. Grammatization which conditions all systems of publication. This concept of grammatization was as forged by Sylvain Auroux, who was the first director of the École Normale Supérieure of Lyon, provides important elements for the discussion inaugurated by Tim Berners-Lee around what he referred to as philosophical engineering. With the concept of grammatization, Auroux was able to think the technical conditions of the appearance of grammata, that is, letters of the alphabet, and of their effects on the understanding and practice of language, and to do so from their pre-alphabetic conditions, ideograms, and so on, and right up until the linguistic technologies that Auroux called language industries, for which Google is the main company today, and passing by a way of the printing press. I have myself extended this concept of grammatization by arguing that grammatization more generally describes all technical processes that enable behavioral fluxes or flows to be made discrete in the mathematical sense, and to be reproduced. Those behavioral flows through which are expressed or imprinted the experiences of human beings, speaking, working, perceiving, interacting, and so on. If grammatization is understood in this way, then the digital is the most recent stage of grammatization, a stage in which all behavioral models can now be grammatized and integrated through a planetary-wide industry of the production, collection, exploitation, and distribution of digital traces, for which Alain Mille is a great specialist of modelized traces. The grammatization of a type of behavior consists in a spatialization of time, given that behavior is, above all, a form of time, a meaningful sequence of words, an operational sequence of gestures, a perceptual flow of sensations, and so on and so on. Spatializing time means, for example, transforming the temporal flow of a speech, such as the one I am delivering to you here and now, into a textual space, or on a Twitter space, a detemporalized form of this speech. It is thus to make a spatial object. And this is what is going on from alphabetic writing to digital technology. As shown by Walter Ong, I quote Ong, he says, "Writing initiated what print and computers only continue, the reduction of dynamic sound to quiescent space," unquote. This spatial object can be engraved on a wall, inscribed on a clay tablet, written or printed on paper, metastabilized on a silicon memory chip, and so on. And these various supports make possible operations that are specific to each form of support, that is, proper to each stage of grammatization. Spoken language is that Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher, called a temporal object, that is, an audible object which only appears in disappearing. But when speech is written down, becoming through this grammatization a spatial object, that is, a synoptically visible object, then synopsis makes possible an understanding that is both analytic, that is discretized, and synthetic, that is unified. This spatialization is a materialization. This does not mean that there was something immaterial that subsequently became material. Nothing is immaterial. For example, my speaking is material. It is produced by vocal organs which produce sound waves which are themselves supported by molecules composed of atoms, molecules that begin to vibrate in surrounding air and so on. One can speak of a visibly spatializing materialization to the extent that there is a passage from an invisible and as such indiscernible and unthinkable material state to another state, a state that can be analyzed, critiqued, and manipulated in both senses that can be given to this verb, to manipulate. That is, first, on which analytical operations can be performed and intelligibility can be produced, and second, with which one can manipulate minds, for which Socrates reproached the sophist in the case of writing. Writing being the specialization of time of what he called living speech. If grammatization is thus a process of materialization, then hominization is itself moreover, and in a very general way, a process of materialization. Man is the living being who fabricates tools, and in so doing, he transforms the world in never ceasing to materialize anticipations, desires, what Husserl called pretensions. And I will explain later why I must here express this through the vocabulary of the founder of phenomenology. Grammatization is a very specific type of materialization within a much larger process of materialization of all kinds that Georges Canguilhem, the French philosopher and doctor, called technical life, which distinguishes us from other living things. Grammatization begins during the Upper Paleolithic Age, some 2 million years after technical life began. It enabled mental and behavioral flows to be made discrete and thus enabled new mental and behavioral models to be created. In this course of materialization and the specialization in which it consists, the constitutive elements of grammatized mental and behavioral flows are made discrete, and temporal mental realities, which have become identifiable through finite lists of analyzable and calculable elements, are modified in return. The visible and tangible emerging from this specialization constitutes an object that belongs to the class of what I call tertiary retention. I borrow the term retention from Husserl. Retention refers to what is retained through a mnesic function, itself constitute of a consciousness, that is, of a psychical apparatus, constitutive of consciousness. Within this psychical retention, Husserl distinguishes two types of retention. One he refers to as primary, and the other secondary. Secondary retention, which is a constitutive element of a mental state, which is always based on memory, was originally a primary retention. Primary means retained in the course of a perception and through the process of this perception, but in the present, which means that primary retention is not yet a memory, even if it is already a retention. The perceive of phenomenon is to retain and unify. To perceive a phenomenon is to retain and unify in the course of the perception of the phenomenon everything that appears as the identical content of the perception of the perceived phenomenon, but that each time presents a different aspect. In German, Husserl says an Abschattung. A primary retention is what, constituting the course of a present experience, is destined to become a secondary retention of somebody who has lived this experience that has become past. Secondary because no longer being perceived, it is imprinted in the memory of the one who had the experience and from which it may be reactivated. But a retention as the result of a flux and emerging from the temporal course of experience can also become tertiary, through the spatialization in which consists the grammatization, and more generally in which consists any technical materialization process of the flow of retentions. This mental reality can thus be projected onto a support that is neither cerebral nor psychical, but rather technical. The web grants access to such a space through which shared digital tertiary retentions are projected and introjected, constituting as such a new public, global, and contributory space, functioning at the speed of the light. What light and what shadow, what enlightenment and what darkness can and must this bring us? Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, spoke about the materialization of knowledge in the book The Archaeology of Knowledge, but without placing it in the context of the grammatization process, nor by understanding it in relation to primary and secondary retention. When he was interested in the archives that make possible all knowledge. Knowledge is, above all, a collection of archived traces, that is, ordered and modeled traces, thereby constituting an order, and submitted to this order and to this model which orders these traces. Knowledge, modeled in this way, thus conserves the trace of the old from which it comes, and of which it is the rebirth and the transformation through a process that Plato described as an anamnesis. The conservation of traces of the old is what enables the constitution of circuits of collective individuation across time and in the framework of a discipline which governs the relations between minds, which individuate themselves in concert and in the course of intergenerational transmission, through which a trans-individuation process is concretized, producing what Gilbert Simondon called the trans-individual, forming what we call significations. Now, the conditions of this process are overdetermined by the characteristics of grammatization, that is, by the characteristics of the archive supports that are tertiary retentions of different epochs, ideograms, manuscript text, prints, records, databases, metadata, and so on. The archive is material, according to Foucault, and knowledge is essentially archived, which means that its materiality is not something which occurs after the fact for recording something which would have occurred before its materialization. This is the very production of knowledge. The materialization does not come after the form that it conserves, and it must be thought beyond the opposition of matter and form. It constitutes what I call a hypermatter. The hypermateriality of knowledge, in the sense of quantum mechanics, if you want, which is not an opposition between matter and form. This hypermateriality of knowledge is that which, in the epoch of the web and of what it produces as new processes of trans-individuation, must be studied as a condition of construction of rational forms of knowledge and of knowledge in general. We must situate the study of the hypermateriality of knowledge within the framework of a general organology, which studies the supports and instruments of every form of knowledge. And in the contemporary context, this study of hypermateriality must be placed at the heart of digital studies, which must itself become the new unifying and transdisciplinary model of every form of academic knowledge. General organology studies the relation between three types of organs characteristic of technical life: physiological organs, technical organs, and social organizations. Grammatization began 30,000 years ago, inaugurating a specific stage of the process of the co-evolution of these three organological spheres, which are inseparable from one another, as shown in an extremely clear way by the neurophysiology of reading, where, as Marianne Wolf puts it, the brain is literally written by the socio-technical organs, and where our own brain, which she calls the reading brain, was once written by alphabetical writing, but now is written by digital writing. I quote Marianne Wolf. She says, "We were never born to read. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the way we were able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of our species." Unquote. Now, with the web, we are living through a passage from the reading brain to the digital brain. And this raises 1,000 questions of rights and duties, in particular in regard to the younger generations. I quote Wolf. She says, "We make the transition from a reading brain to an increasingly digital one. Reading evolves historically and restructures its biological underpinnings in the brain of what must be thought as a literate species," unquote. And the question during this transition is to know, I quote, "what it is important to preserve," unquote. It is a question of knowing what we must preserve within the digital brain, or that which characterizes the reading brain, given that writing new circuits in the brain can erase or make illegible the old circuits. The writing of the psychophysiological organs through the socio-technical organs constitutes the reality of the history of thought, that is, of what Hegel called and described as the phenomenology of the Geist, of spirit, except that within this phenomenology of tertiary retention that I am talking about here, techniques is the main dynamic factor, and does not precisely insofar as it constitutes a system, and does so precisely insofar as it constitutes a system of tertiary retention, this dynamic being ignored by Hegel and philosophy in general. The emergence of digital technologies, of the internet and the web, which is also the age of industrial tertiary retention, is obviously the new page, a hypertextual and hypermaterial page, on which is inscribed and read in HTML5 the history of thought, through what must be understood as a new system of publication constituting a new public thing, a new res publica, a new republic. The web constitutes an apparatus of reading and writing founded on automata that enable the production of metadata on the basis of digital metalanguages, which change what Michel Foucault called the processes of enunciation and discursive formations. All this can only be thought on the condition of studying in detail the neurophysiological, technological, and socio-political conditions and socio-economical conditions of the materialization of the time of thinking. And not only of thinking, but also of life and of the unthought of what one calls noetic beings, which is also undoubtedly of their unconscious in the Freudian sense. It is for this reason that we must develop a general organology capable of specifying the characteristics, the cause, and the stakes of a process which began in the Upper Paleolithic as a materialization of the flux of consciousness, projecting new kinds of mental representations forged through this very projection, and which we shall now see it is also an introjection. From this repastral projection, which is also the birth of art, the exteriorization of the mental content of the mind begins. After the Neolithic age, specific retentional forms appear, which make possible the control of mental context as the first forms of calculation, then as a step-by-step recording of geometric reasoning, that is the origin of reason, and such that mind, self-controlling and self-critiquing constitutes the origin of logos, as identified by Husserl in 1936 when he saw that the origin of geometry was founded on literal, that is later tertiary retention. From the origin of philosophy and up until our own age, this process has been concealed. Its study was made impossible by the metaphysics of fundamental ontology, conceived as an ontology of pure thought, that is, prior to the impurity of its exteriorization, a thought that Kant would call a priori, and that this metaphysics would take to be the only true knowledge, where being is presumed to precede becoming, and thus to make itself knowable. Today, grammatization spreads and accelerates and transforms all forms of knowledge at a time when we are able, also learning from neurophysiology, that cerebral plasticity and transformation of what Marion Wolf calls mental circuitry through the introduction of tertiary retentions, literal tertiary retentions, for example, is thinking. Thinking consists in the production of new circuits through the materialization process that comes to modify existing circuits and sometimes to destroy them. The question being to know what must be preserved. This constitution of the mind through the introduction of tertiary retention has today become visible because it can be experimentally studied by neurophysiologists equipped with apparatus through which they can observe the life of the mind, that is, of movements occurring within the cerebral apparatus, like introjection, but also and above all between this apparatus and the apparatus of tertiary retention emerging from grammatization, that is, from the projection of the mind outside itself. The fact that the exteriorization of the mind is the condition of its constitution means that the mind cannot be a pure substance that, by exteriorizing itself, alienates itself through this exteriorization. The constitution of the mind through its exteriorization is its expression as a result of a prior impression. The projection of the mind outside itself constitutes the mind through its materialization and spatialization as a movement. The mind is as such mobility, motility in the sense of Freud, and emotion in the sense of Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, the French philosopher. This is how we should interpret the thesis of Antonio Damasio, in my opinion. This projection that is constitutive of the mind, however, can also discharge it. It makes possible what Socrates described as a short circuit of the life of the mind through an exteriorization without return, that is, without re-interiorization. Projection can in fact only constitute a mind insofar as it re-temporalizes that which, spatializing itself, must be individuated and interiorized in order to come to life. Tertiary retention is dead, and it remains so if it does not transform through a reverse effect the secondary retentions of the psychical individual affected by this tertiary retention. This transformation of the individual is possible because the latter has, for example, literalized his own brain, which has thus become a reading brain, and is therefore now a weave of literalized secondary retentions, that is textualized secondary retention and becomes as such the object of constant self-interpretations, because the text must be interpreted. And it is for this reason that Joseph Epstein can write that, I quote, "We are what we read," unquote. And this is what Walter Ong made comprehensible when he wrote that literate human beings are, I quote, "beings whose thought processes do not grow out of simply natural powers, but out of these powers as structured, directly or indirectly, by the technology of writing. Without writing, the literate mind would not and could not think as it does, not only when engaged in writing, but normally even when it is composing its thoughts in oral form," unquote. In other words, even when he speaks and expresses himself orally, the literate human being is reading himself and interpreting himself to the letter. That is, he is literally in the course of writing himself, given that everything he reads inscribes itself in his brain, and given that everything he reads reactivates and interprets the previously and textually written circuits of his secondary retentions. The literate human being speaks like the book that he is and that he reads. What Marianne Wolf adds, however, and through referring to Stanislas Dehaene, the French neurophysiologist, is that the acquisition of new retentional competencies through the interiorization of tertiary retention can also replace existing circuits, that is, destroy them, and that this is why it is a question of knowing what must be preserved. Moreover, Socrates argued that exteriorization cannot occur without reinteriorization, that is, without individuation for producing real thoughts, and that it is therefore necessary as a law and a duty to struggle against the sophistic drift. What consequences can we draw from these considerations within the framework of our encounter here today, and from the perspective of a reactivation of the Enlightenment project in the age of the web? I will conclude by attempting to give a broader outline of an answer to this question. The writing of the brain is the writing of capacities for cooperating between brains, notably as constitutions of communities of reading, that is, lettered or literate brains, or digital brains. Socrates, however, argued that by enabling souls and their brains to be short-circuited or bypassed, the writing of the brain can also destroy both noetic and social capacities, intellectual capacities if you want, and result in structural incapacitation, that is, lead to an inability to think for oneself. I use here the term incapacitation in the sense of the great Indian economist Amartya Sen. This means that the interiorization of technical organs by the cerebral organ, which is thereby reorganized, only constitutes a new stage of thinking on the condition that social organizations exist to ensure this interiorization, such as, for example, the paideia practiced at Plato's academy. The question of what must be preserved is thus a matter of social circuits, and not only cerebral circuits. Providing better access to the internet, therefore, requires thoroughly rethinking the formation and transmission of knowledge with a view to ensuring an historical understanding of the role of tertiary retention in the constitution as well as the destruction of knowledge, and with a view to deriving on this basis a practical and theoretical understanding of the digital tertiary retention that transforms cerebral and social organization. Without such a politics, The inevitable destiny of the digital brain is to find itself slowly but surely short-circuited by automata, and thus find itself incapable of constituting a new form of society and thought with other digital brains. Automation makes digitalization possible. But if it immeasurably increases the power of the mind, that is, the mind as rationalization, it can also destroy the mind's knowledge as rationality. A pharmacological thinking of the digital must study the contradictory dimensions of automation in order to counteract its destructive effects on knowledge. The point is not merely to ensure there is a right to access the internet, but of having a right and a duty to know through education that there are invisible automatisms which may escape digital brains and which may manipulate them without teaching them how to handle them. This question arises in a context in which neuromarketing is today in a position to directly solicit the automatisms of the lower layers of the cerebral organs by short-circuiting or bypassing the networks inscribed through education in the neocortex of the digital brains and the reading brains. That the automatisms of the nervous systems are in this way combining with technological automatisms is the threat that is a shadow against which the new enlightenment must struggle. Thinking is above all the history of grammatization, the history of the relations of projection and introjections between the cerebral apparatus and tertiary retentions. It is for this reason that the question of philosophical engineering arises, as posed by Tim Berners-Lee. Philosophical engineering must lead to a close articulation between psychosomatic organs, technological organs, and social organizations, while ensuring that the technological layer does not short-circuit the psychosomatic and social layers. It is a question of creating an intelligent articulation between the social web and the semantic web, and where these two must not be opposed, but rather composed through social and educational organizations, completely rethought from this perspective. What at the Institute for Research and Innovation in Paris we call technologies of trans-individuation, through which must be constituted the organs of a contributive society. Such are the mainstays of digital studies for which we will organize a conference in next December at the Pompidou Center at the end of this year. I will invite you to participate to this conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernard. We had not a lot of time, but we have just time for one or two questions. Is okay? Going straight to the mics. Thank you.
Hi.
If you can present yourself before.
Yeah, my name is Mihai Héder. Today I'm here as a developer for Computer and Control Institute of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, but I also happen to be a PhD student in the philosophy of science. So it was really exciting for me to hear this great explanation and how you approached from the critical theory this new age. But I also often find that critical theory itself is really hard to teach or to understand for engineers because they often have this naive Platonism and the formal thinking. But at least this is what I got from the computer science school. So it is a technical question. What do you think needs to be done in order to make this system of thought of yours more accessible to an engineer, for instance? Thanks.
Very interesting and difficult question. Maybe there are two main answers to your question for me. The first is that for making understandable those let's say, critical theories coming from mainly continental philosophy, Germany particularly, we must criticize them. Because the difficulty for an engineer to understand what is at stake precisely in those critiques is produced by a repression of the question of techniques. I will give you an example. When Adorno and Horkheimer wrote this very important book, which is Dialektik der Aufklärung, the dialectic of reason in English, they tried to explain that Hollywood, that is the city of cinema, it was in 1944, was short-circuiting what is called by Immanuel Kant transcendental imagination, that is our faculty of imagination, which was, for Kant, the core of the consciousness, of a transcendental consciousness. They say that this faculty, this transcendental faculty, transcendental meaning pure faculty, before becoming, acquired before becoming, not exactly inner, but transcendental in this sense, a priori. They said that the production of cinema by Hollywood was short-circuiting this faculty because it was an exteriorization of this faculty. And for me, what is really the question is not that it was an exteriorization, because this faculty is produced by the exteriorization at the origin of the lithic tool production 2 billion years ago. So the question, when you are an engineer, and myself, I am a teacher for engineers in the University of Compiègne, when you are trying to explain to an engineer this theory, which is extremely formal and transcendental, and in which the material has no role in the production of thought, it is impossible to understand for him what is really at stake and what is his discourse. Now, generally, it is the reason for which there is a rejection of this philosophy. And this is an error, because this philosophy is extremely important, and it is at the origin of all the kinds of disciplines, scientific disciplines like geometry, arithmetic, physics, etc., psychology, etc., etc. Even computer sciences, because computer sciences is a materialization of logic, and logic comes from Plato and Aristotle. Now, the first problem is to propose a new critique of this critical theory, which can integrate the questions produced particularly by the contemporary organology of mind, which is the digital. And this is the reason for which the Institute for Research and Innovation cooperate with Alexander Mona and Harry Halpin with the W3C for this seminar on web philosophy, because we consider that this engineering, philosophical engineering, is really what is the main question today. Second answer I can give you is that we must transform our supports of publication and edition of those questions. And this is the reason for which I created with my friend Vincent Puig this Institute for Research and Innovation. The main question for this institute is to create new processes of publication, because what is producing reasonable knowledges, rational knowledges, is a peer-to-peer system of publication. But we need to create systems for publication not only for the market, because the market is interested only by business and profit. It is normal. It's not, for me, a default, but it is. It's not sufficient. We need to develop other kinds of systems of publication for particularly research and transmission of knowledge. So, for example, it is possible to use images, to use indexing, to use metadata, to use collective contribution by for example, polemic tweet at this moment for organizing controversies, discussions, etc., so, and polemics and logical aggregation of what we call collective individuation, etc., etc. So it's a long I could continue for a long time, but I must stop because
you have not a long time now. Sorry for that. So
thank you
very much for the question. Thank you very much for the answer.